You've probably taken a flight and trusted the pilot with your life. But what if the real danger was sitting in the cockpit, quietly waiting for you to take off? This is the true story of how one man turned a routine flight into an unspeakable tragedy, and nobody could stop him. On the clear morning of March 24, 2015, Germanwings Flight 9525 departed Barcelona for Düsseldorf with 150 people on board, 144 passengers and 6 crew from 19 countries. Among them were business travelers, vacationers, and a German high school class returning from an exchange trip in Spain. In the cockpit, Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, 34, a veteran pilot with over 6,000 hours, and First Officer Andreas Lubitz, 27, with 630 hours and a reputation for being calm and capable. Flight 9525 lifted off at 10:01 a.m. CET, 26 minutes behind schedule, a routine delay. After climbing to 38,000 feet, the aircraft cruised smoothly over the Mediterranean. All appeared normal. The flight progressed uneventfully into French airspace. The captain and Lubitz chatted casually, reviewing the weather and preparing for the upcoming landing in Düsseldorf. Outside, the spring sun shone over the Alps. Inside the cabin, passengers relaxed in their seats, some reading or napping after an early morning start. Flight 9525 was utterly ordinary, until it wasn't. At around 10:30 a.m., as the jet leveled off in cruise, Captain Sondenheimer unbuckled his harness. He excused himself and stepped out of the cockpit, likely for a brief restroom break. It was a mundane moment on any flight, a senior pilot leaving a trusted co-pilot at the controls for just a couple of minutes. But this routine act was about to mark the beginning of an unfathomable nightmare. Lubitz was alone at the helm now, and in those few minutes of solitude, the fate of 150 people would be sealed by a horrifying choice. It started with something small, but deeply unsettling. Captain Sondenheimer returned from the bathroom and found the cockpit door locked. He knocked. No answer. He tried the security code. Still nothing. Inside, First Officer Lubitz had manually locked the door, overriding the code. The captain's knocks turned into frantic pounding. The reinforced cockpit door, built after September 11th to stop hijackers, was now locking out the actual pilot. Passengers in the front rows could hear the commotion. Confused, flight attendants tried to help, but nothing worked. Inside, Lubitz was silent. Alone in the cockpit, he had taken full control. At 10:31 a.m., without warning or clearance, Lubitz set the autopilot to descend. From 38,000 feet to just 100, the plane started dropping fast, around 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute. French air traffic control noticed and tried to contact the aircraft. No response. A military jet was scrambled, but Flight 9525 was already heading straight for the Alps. Time was running out. Inside the sealed cockpit, the only sound was Lubitz's steady breathing, recorded on the cockpit voice recorder. He said nothing. Automated warnings began to echo. Terrain, terrain, pull up. But the co-pilot ignored them, resolute on his deadly course. In the cabin, the reality of the situation set in with horrific clarity. As the Airbus passed through 20,000 feet in a steady dive toward the Alps, passengers and crew undoubtedly felt the unsettling sensation of continuous descent. Oxygen masks did not drop. This wasn't an abrupt depressurization, but a controlled dive. So those on board were fully conscious, aware, and growing more terrified each passing second. Some passengers cried out, others gripped their armrests. Many began to pray or send final text messages. The captain outside the cockpit frantically sought anything to break down the door, perhaps a crash axe from the galley. But even that proved futile against the reinforced barrier. His cries of, "Open the door!" met only silence. At 10:40 a.m., just 9 minutes after the descent began, Germanwings 9525 had almost reached the same altitude as the peaks below. In the cockpit, ground proximity alerts were blaring. In the cabin, screams of despair filled the final moments. One can only imagine the sheer panic and sorrow. 150 people facing the unthinkable, utterly helpless. Then at 10:41 a.m., in a remote part of the French Alps, the plane slammed into the mountainside at about 700 kilometers per hour, instantly disintegrating on impact. The screams, the alarms, the pounding on the door, all of it fell deathly quiet. The broken pieces of the Airbus littered the rocky ravine over a 2-square-kilometer area, the largest fragment no bigger than a family car. Germanwings Flight 525 was gone. All 150 aboard were dead. In just minutes, a routine flight had descended into horror, leaving the world in shock and searching for answers. Rescuers who arrived at the crash site found devastation. Flight 525's wreckage scattered across a remote alpine mountainside. No one had survived. Helicopters lowered crews to recover the black boxes. The cockpit voice recorder, found that same day, revealed something chilling. The crash was no accident. 2 days later, a French prosecutor stunned the world. Co-pilot Andreas Lubitz had locked out the captain and deliberately crashed the plane. Investigators soon uncovered Lubitz's hidden struggles. Years earlier, during flight training, he had paused to seek psychiatric help for severe depression. Though he returned and earned his license, that dark episode foreshadowed the tragedy. In the months before the crash, Lubitz's mental health declined again. His home held torn-up medical leave slips, diagnosing him unfit to fly. One doctor even warned he shouldn't be in the cockpit, but strict privacy laws kept these warnings from Germanwings. Lubitz hid his illness and kept flying. Digging further, authorities uncovered that Lubitz had been researching disturbing topics in the weeks before the crash. His internet history showed searches for methods of suicide and, ominously, queries about cockpit door security systems. It became evident that his deadly plan was premeditated. The flight data recorder confirmed that on the very morning of the crash, during the earlier outbound flight from Düsseldorf to Barcelona, Lubitz had briefly practiced inputting a controlled descent on the autopilot when he was alone in the cockpit, a rehearsal for the deadly act he would execute on Flight 525. Investigators also learned that Lubitz was plagued by a fear of losing his vision. He had seen dozens of doctors for an eye condition he believed he had, even though it might have been psychosomatic. He feared that failing eyesight would end his flying career, a prospect he seemingly could not bear. In his distorted logic, Lubitz decided to end his life and make a dark mark on the world in the process. The crash of Flight 525 was the culmination of that fatal resolve, a grim act of murder-suicide as the French BEA investigation formally concluded. The revelations raised serious questions about how Germanwings and its parent company Lufthansa had missed, or perhaps underestimated, the warning signs. How could a pilot with known depression history and recent suicidal ideation slip through the cracks? It turned out Lubitz had exploited the trust inherent in aviation's medical system, relying on self-disclosure and doctor-patient confidentiality. Lufthansa's medical checks relied on pilots to volunteer any health issues, and Lubitz said nothing. He obtained doctor's notes to excuse him from work, but simply hid them from the airline, ensuring no one at Germanwings knew of his mental collapse. Legally, under German law, companies couldn't access an employee's private medical records. This tragedy starkly exposed the flaw in that system. Trust, in a pilot's honesty about his fitness to fly, was a pillar of the industry. Andreas Lubitz betrayed that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. By the end of the investigation, the uncomfortable truth was clear. The disaster was not caused by mechanical failure or terrorism, but by the inner demons of one man who kept them hidden until it was too late. The world reacted with grief and fury as the truth of Flight 525 came out. Families of the victims were devastated to learn that their loved ones were lost not to a random accident, but to an act of calculated evil. In Germany, at the Joseph Koenig School in Haltern, candles and flowers piled high in tribute to the 16 students and 2 teachers who never came home. Memorial services were held in Barcelona and Düsseldorf, the start and intended end of that ill-fated journey. At Düsseldorf Airport, a somber memorial site with flowers and photos became a gathering place for mourners. Political leaders from 3 nations traveled to the crash site in the French Alps to pay respects. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, France's President, with Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve, and Spain's Prime Minister all stood side by side in mourning. "This is a picture of horror," Germany's Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said of the scene. Public anger swelled as well, with many asking how this could have been allowed to happen. Lawsuits were filed by some families, alleging negligence on the part of the airline for letting Lubitz fly. In later court rulings, Lufthansa would maintain that it could not have known of Lubitz's hidden illness, given the medical privacy laws. Lufthansa and Germanwings executives, shattered by the betrayal from within, offered condolences and compensation, about €75,000 to each victim's family, plus additional support for pain and suffering. Money, of course, could not begin to heal the wound. For the aviation industry, Germanwings Flight 9525 became a catalyst for change. The most immediate reform addressed the cockpit door dilemma. In the days following the crash, airlines around the world rushed to implement a new rule. 2 authorized crew members must be in the cockpit at all times. No pilot would ever be left alone controlling a plane. Notably, this policy was later relaxed in Europe after a few years as regulators reassessed the risk, but many airlines kept it in place. More enduring were the reforms around pilot mental health. The European Aviation Safety Agency, EOSA, and other regulators introduced new directives to strengthen psychological evaluation and support for pilots. Airlines were for the first time required to conduct psychological screenings of new pilots before hire and to set up confidential support programs so pilots suffering from mental issues could seek help without fear of career ruin. Regular physical exams for pilots, once focused largely on medical fitness, now include mental health assessments. Random drug and alcohol testing was also mandated across European airlines, aiming to catch any impairments that could jeopardize safety. These changes acknowledged a sobering reality. A pilot's well-being is as critical to flight safety as the aircraft's engines or avionics. No one wanted to ever see a repeat of the Germanwings tragedy. Over time, the physical wreckage in the Alps was cleared, but the emotional wreckage remains. At the crash site near La Vernay in France, a simple memorial marks the remote mountainside where Flight 9525 met its end. Each year on March 24th, families of the victims gather there and in their home countries to remember the lives lost. They speak of beloved sons and daughters, husbands and wives, colleagues and friends, all gone too soon. The story of Germanwings 9525 haunts the collective memory of air travelers and pilots alike. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest threat to a flight comes not from without, but from within. In the end, the disaster forced aviation to confront the fragile psyche behind the locked cockpit door. Safety isn't just about steel and software, but also about the humans entrusted with control. And so, the tale of Flight 9525 ends with a lesson written in heartbreak. The catastrophe was not caused by a bomb, nor by a hijacker in the cabin. The danger came from the one place everyone assumed they were absolutely safe, the cockpit. A pilot trusted with lives became the instrument of their deaths. It is a chilling truth that leaves us all uneasy, especially those who work or travel in aviation. Ultimately, the tragedy of Germanwings Flight 9525 can be summed up in one harrowing realization. It wasn't a hijacker. It wasn't a bomb. It was trust that turned into tragedy. Some stories leave you with questions that never get answered. This is one of them. If this made you feel something, shock, sadness, even anger, share it. Because behind every flight number is a human story we can't afford to forget. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe. We're just getting started.